Human nature has a vast range of potential. At its best, its unwavering perseverance affords endlessly more astounding achievements. At its worst, its unflinching stubbornness spells the destruction of all it has created. Humans make mistakes, therefore how we respond to those mistakes often reveals more about us than the mistakes do themselves. To err is human. To forgive, divine. Indeed, the power of forgiveness, of others and of oneself, can elevate humanity beyond its tendency to exaggerate the faults of others and to ignore one's own. Not acknowledging one's own shortcomings is in fact a fast track to extremism, and just as it is important to reflect on one's own perspective, so is it important to be open to the perspectives of others, flawed as they almost certainly are. The BioShock series explores some of the consequences of humans holding extreme ideologies, and in a 2007 interview with Eurogamer, BioShock game director Ken Levine said, "The trouble is, philosophies are these ideals, and people are not ideal. And what happens when people mix up with these ideals? That's what Rapture is. Really interesting ideas, screwed up by the fact that we're people." Although Levine didn't direct BioShock 2, I think this idea also applies to that game, and while he did direct BioShock Infinite, I don't think it was ever meant to apply there. Infinite treats its ideologies, shall we say, differently than the first two games do theirs.
Come on! Are you gonna throw it? Or are you taking your coffee black these days?
And so this video series will focus mostly on BioShock and BioShock 2. The novels Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand and 1984 by George Orwell inspired many aspects of the world of BioShock 1 and 2, but comparisons between the societies they described and the games they inspired reveal that the games are almost entirely disinterested in the philosophical merit of the ideologies the novels present. The characters in the games are not perfect embodiments of the philosophies that inspire them, nor are the games philosophical takedowns of their source materials. Rather, they aim to criticize the fallibility of human nature, regardless of the ideal in question. Indeed, at the heart of many moral quandaries of the games is the question of what it even means to be human. How do humans behave in certain circumstances? What makes one human? And can it be taken away? Are the little sisters still human? The big daddies? The thinker? If Subject Delta can be unconditioned, then was his humanity ever taken away, or merely hidden? Closely related to the question of humanity is that of free will and choice. After all, Andrew Ryan makes his idea on what it means to be human quite clear. A man chooses, a slave obeys. Indeed, even Sofia Lamb sees transcending free will and consciousness as the only way to transcend humanity and become a utopian. The endings of the first two games are determined by the very few choices the player is allowed to make, given that both games are linear narratives. Since the ending of a story often reveals its theme, however, the choices the player makes decide the moral outlook of a particular playthrough of one of the games. It follows, therefore, that the message of the games as a whole accounts for all possible choice sequences and all endings, as opposed to just one. If then the games aren't exactly taking down the philosophies that inspired them, then what exactly are they saying about human nature, given all possible choices? Well, to answer that, we need to do some digging into the world of BioShock, as well as those of the source materials that inspired it. We need to examine the moral implications of each choice the player makes in terms of the game and in terms of the appropriate ideology. Perhaps most importantly, we need to understand where the games diverge from the philosophies that inspired them and take on their own unideal, human perspective. Because to err is human. Beware spoilers for BioShock and Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand left the Soviet Union for the United States in 1926 at the age of 21. Later in life, she would claim to have always believed in the philosophy which would become known as Objectivism, but while she had depicted it in several works already, it wasn't until she published Atlas Shrugged in 1957 that she truly felt she had encapsulated her ideas in a work of fiction. Objectivism would later be codified in non-fiction writings of her own and of others, but Atlas Shrugged remains her most well-known work, especially among her many critics, literary as well as moral. If you're familiar with BioShock, you'll at least have a passive understanding of the most basic tenets of Objectivism, though it's important to recognize the differences between the ideals it presents and the harsh reality that the game puts forth. In short, Objectivism gets its name from its existential philosophy, namely, existence exists. A is A. Objectivism prioritizes logic, rationality, and truth, and argues that morally, there can be no greater purpose in life than the pursuit of one's own happiness, and that therefore one must use reason to aspire towards one's own rational self-interest. Rand applied these values to many fields, including aesthetics, law, ethics, relationships, economics, and more, and most of these ideas faced some degree of criticism, commonly either for disregarding the potential value of subjectivity, especially in art, which many maintain is inherently subjective, or for dismissing the notion of having a moral obligation to aid one's fellow man. Rand was not against being kind, per se. Rather, she took issue with altruism, specifically the idea that one is morally obligated to give one's resources for the sake of another. Objectivism regards such an obligation as destructive to individualism and free will, and it argues that it ought to be a person's choice what to do with their time, money, labor, etc. These foundational components lead Objectivism to reject all forms of religion and authoritarianism in favor of emphasizing the power of the individual. This is where BioShock gets the first introduction to Andrew Ryan's philosophy. No gods or kings, only man. Okay, quick rundown of Atlas Shrugged. And yes, I read the whole book.
The whole plate.
In the near future relative to 1957, the people of the world do not value the self, the mind, productivity, reality, creativity, etc. John Galt, a worker at a motor company whose owners institute counterproductive policies, instead rejects the new philosophy and aims to, quote, stop the motor of the world. He disappears, secretly convincing the remaining rationalists to join him in his strike of the mind. The question, who is John Galt, which inspires the Who is Atlas posters all over Rapture, becomes a helpless cry uttered by those who don't understand why the world is being drained of its productive thinkers. The novel's protagonist, Dagny Taggart, the industrious vice president of the Taggart Transcontinental Railroad, continues to work for the sake of her own mind in a world that no longer respects her abilities, and she is one of the last to join Galt's strike. Most of the novel is a vehicle for a single speech, which takes up an entire 60-page chapter. Part 3, A is A, Chapter 7, This is John Galt Speaking, wherein Galt hijacks a public broadcast on the state of the world's moral crisis to deliver his philosophy and reveal his intent, and it doubles as Ayn Rand's opportunity to say, this is what I mean, in more direct terms. Despite its greater length, I'm gonna guess that Galt's speech is what inspired Andrew Ryan's message upon entering Rapture.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture.
BioShock takes most of its inspiration regarding objectivism from Atlas Shrugged, and the game is packed full of references to its story and characters, especially in their names, though I'd hardly be the first to point them out. Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand, Tenenbaum and Rand's birth name Rosenbaum, Atlas and Atlas Shrugged. Perhaps the cleverest is the location of Rapture. In Atlas Shrugged, Dagny Taggart gives the nickname Atlantis to Galt's Gulch, the striker's hidden community in the mountains of Colorado, since one of the popular folk legends of John Galt has him supposedly discovering Atlantis. The real-life legends of Atlantis, of course, feature a city either lost or hidden under the sea, and so when adapting the secret society, Atlantis, of Atlas Shrugged to the game BioShock, the developers decided to set it underwater. As Andrew Ryan would later say,
"It was not impossible to build Rapture at the bottom of the sea. It was impossible to build it anywhere else."
I want to use a particular moment in Atlas Shrugged to illustrate how BioShock heightens its portrayal of objectivism. In Part 3, A is A, Chapter 2, The Utopia of Greed, John Galt explains to Dagny that her account in Atlantis will be charged room and board for however long she stays recovering from the injuries from her airplane crash as she secretly followed him into the city. Dagny, however, refuses to pay and instead offers to earn her room and board by working as Galt's cook and housemaid, which causes him to laugh unexpectedly. You see, to Galt, Dagny's offering her work means much more than his simply taking her money as payment. It is about money, but it's also about value and pride and self-worth. Dagny won't let her injuries stop her from working in whatever way she can, and that is exactly the kind of determined attitude that Galt admires. In BioShock, these ideas are heightened even further. Charging someone room and board after they survive a plane crash? Nah, the bathroom stalls cost money. After all, handyman turned general contractor Bill McDonough deserves his due. You can't just use the product of someone's labor without reciprocation, vital bodily functions or otherwise. This is a common thread for the world of Rapture, an idea from Atlas Shrugged heightened to the extreme, and almost to the point of parody in Burial at Sea, but that's neither here nor there. BioShock Infinite is another video for another time. With that in mind, let's take a look at Andrew Ryan's philosophy.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck. Have some chosen to destroy themselves with careless splicing, undeniable. But I will make no proclamations. I will dictate no laws. The great chain moves slowly, but with wisdom.
The inspiration is obvious, but it's interesting to note how the metaphor of the Great Chain is viewed almost religiously. Ryan claims to believe in no God, but his attitude echoes the saying, God works in mysterious ways. Imagine an entire society built around Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand that guides a free market economy. At what point does a metaphor become a superstition? At what point does a superstition become a faith? Also notice how Ryan regards the abuse of Adam, which is likened to an addictive drug, as a self-destructive choice. Society may impose standards for beauty and advertising may be manipulative, but at the end of the day, the splicers brought their demise upon themselves. And this isn't the only uncompromising view of people Ryan holds.
On the surface, the parasite expects the doctor to heal them for free, the farmer to feed them out of charity. How little they differ from the pervert who prowls the streets looking for a victim he can ravish for his grotesque amusement.
So, did Ayn Rand liken altruism to rape? Not exactly, but the exaggeration isn't miles off. Ryan is still within the realm of objectivism in that he and Rand both view every service, even the most basic and crucial ones to life, as trades that must be mutually beneficial. Ryan's antagonistic depiction, however, compared to John Galt's heroic one, reveals different authorial purposes. Galt is striking, and he fully intends to return to the world when the outsiders learn to respectability, or die for not doing so, while Ryan has opted to leave the parasites to their own devices and is only concerned with not letting them into Rapture. He has no plans to reclaim the world, as far as we know. So of course, it's very important that Ryan invites only the most capable individuals to Rapture, because for most people it's a one-way trip. Bill McDonough's story in particular is quite the microcosm of all of Rapture's, as it shows the rise and fall of Ryan's adherence to his original ideals.
I met Ryan the day me and the lads were installing the bathroom plumbing up in his Posh Park Avenue digs. "Oi," says he, "what's with all the brass fittings? General contractor had me down for the tin." "Well," I says, "I suppose it's the contractor then who'll be bailing out your loo once a fortnight, is it? If it's price you're worried about, I'll be picking up the brass, so not to worry, Squire." "And why would you be doing that?" says he. "Well, Mr. Ryan, profit or not, no man bails water out of privies built by Bill McDonough." Next day I finds out I'm Ryan's new general contractor.
Remember how Dagny offered to work for John Galt and he agreed to hire her because she demonstrated taking pride in her work? The same thing's going on here. A common misconception about objectivism is that it prioritizes profit so highly that it promotes cutting costs and corners at every opportunity. In reality, objectivism is more concerned with quality work, taking pride in quality work and trading fairly for quality work. It also accounts for the fact that bailing out a flooding bathroom every 2 weeks in the long run would cost more than using brass fittings in the first place, and McDonough's having the expertise to realize this is another reason to hire him. So as I said, it is about money, but also a lot more. Basically, to objectivism, money is not a holy grail to chase blindly. It's a metric that measures one's abilities, one of which is foresight. So far, Ryan is pretty close to objectivism in practice, and for a while his approach to governing is working quite well for Rapture. But, as we know, it doesn't last much longer.
There has been tremendous pressure to regulate this plasmid business. There have been side effects, blindness, insanity. death. But what use is our ideology if it is not tested? The market does not respond like an infant, shrieking at the first sign of displeasure. The market is patient, and we must be too.
At the heart of BioShock's depiction of an attempt at an objectivist society is the assertion that all humans, no matter how industrious and intelligent, are fallible. Without any kind of regulation, the brightest minds will eventually stumble on something that humanity is not prepared to handle, and their lack of foresight will spell the destruction of their society. This is a criticism of objectivism insofar as it claims that objectivism is too optimistic, ironically. No matter how exclusive you make the club, and no matter how thoroughly you vet your inhabitants, people are people, and cosmetics and FOMO and peer pressure and advertising and addiction combined overwhelm even the most cautious citizens. Objectivism would say that such people don't belong in an objectivist society, that those who would sacrifice their safety for superficial appearances and fear of missing out are not rational people. However, BioShock argues that human society of all kinds creates these pressures. They aren't personal forces overcome by sheer willpower, but social forces ingrained in every human community, objectivist or otherwise. It's fitting, therefore, that BioShock features a story of a capable person going too far, and the pressure of cosmetic enhancement, all in one.
When Picasso became bored of painting people, he started representing them as cubes and other abstract forms. The world called him a genius. I've spent my entire surgical career creating the same tired shapes over and over again. The upturned nose, the cleft chin, the ample bosom. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could do with a knife what that old Spaniard did with a brush?
Ideally, you wouldn't want people like Dr. Steinman in your objectivist society, but BioShock argues that power corrupts, and that freedom from obstruction reveals people's innermost machinations. In reality, Dr. Steinman may have always wanted to disfigure human features deep down, but only the lax social structure of Rapture allowed him to realize his hidden desire. Bringing together the most capable people from every field without considering why those people were motivated to become so skilled can lead to conflicting interests. Of course, the irony of it is that you also get the most capable individuals in fields you did not expect, and may not want. And what greater criminal mind is there, what more capable con man exists, than Frank Fontaine?
This Fontaine fellow is somebody to watch. Once he was just a menace, to be convicted and hung. But he always manages to be where the evidence isn't. He's the most dangerous type of hoodlum, the kind with vision.
As Ryan insisted on governmental inaction while the people of Rapture suffered, a niche developed for someone to care for the destitute. But with no one to fill that niche genuinely, Rapture produced someone to fill it falsely, to provide for others not for their sake, but for his own. Frank Fontaine embodies accepting objectivism's ends without accepting its means, pursuing self-interest not by creation but by theft. And as we know, Andrew Ryan is not the true antagonist of BioShock. Frank Fontaine is. Poverty is not the cause of the Civil War. Power is. And objectivism is not the downfall of Rapture. Humanity is.
The death penalty in Rapture. Council's in an uproar. Riots in the streets, they say. But this is the time for leadership. Action must be taken against the smugglers. Any contact with the surface exposes Rapture to the very parasites we fled from. A few stretched necks or a small price to pay for our ideals.
To be clear, Ayn Rand took no moral issue with capital punishment insofar as those who commit a crime that disregards another's right to life, e.g. murder, in doing so forfeit their own right to life. However, since in practice it is often difficult to prove cases beyond reasonable doubt, she argued that the death penalty ought only to be applied in the most egregious and certain of circumstances. More generally speaking, Rand considered the initiation of force, as in violent crimes, to be a forfeit of respect and rights from those who use their mind. In Atlas Shrugged Part 3, A as A, Chapter 2, The Utopia of Greed again, Dagny meets Ragnar Danashold. I either spent too much time or not enough time researching how to pronounce that, so here's the hoping. He's the philosopher-turned-pirate who views himself as a reverse Robin Hood, though the other strikers do not approve of his methods. Danashold tells Dagny that violence is not practical. If my fellow men believe that the force of the combined tonnage of their muscles is a practical means to rule me, let them learn the outcome of a contest in which there's nothing but brute force on one side and force ruled by a mind on the other. Dunneshold is content to fight the looters at their own game of "it's mine." Andrew Ryan justifies his actions similarly, but his commitment to wage war on the citizens of Rapture would be a bridge too far for Objectivism. Saying that a few stretched necks are only a small price to pay is a slippery slope that foreshadows his power-driven fall from grace. As he began ignoring the problems surfacing in Rapture, so did he start drifting away from a purely objectivist philosophy towards something more authoritarian, even as his closest advisors like Bill McDonough tried to keep him on course.
Mr. Ryan, I believe in Rapture, but that doesn't mean we always win. Fontaine Futuristics is the biggest thing going in Rapture, so let me be plain. When we arrest that tow rag Fontaine for his thieving and smuggling, we must make it clear that we won't touch his business interests. We can get on top of this. We can. Here's what we do. We find Fontaine's will and make what was his go to where it was intended, and not into the pockets of us that put him into the ground.
In this council, McDonough shows a much more committed understanding of Ryan's original beliefs than even he does. McDonough wants to uphold Rapture's philosophy in the face of those who seek to destroy it, to treat criminals' property with the same respect as that of any other citizen. It's actually quite benevolent, and while McDonough puts the philosophy of Rapture over petty revenge on Fontaine, Ryan sees Fontaine's smuggling as a personal attack, and vengeance quickly clouds his judgment.
Dr. Suchong, frankly, I'm shocked by your proposal. If we were to modify the structure of our commercial plasmid line as you propose, to have them make the user vulnerable to mental suggestion through pheromones, would we not be able to effectively control the actions of the citizens of Rapture? Free will is the cornerstone of this city. The thought of sacrificing it is abhorrent. However, we are indeed in a time of war.
If a man chooses and a slave obeys, then Ryan has, by his own definition, enslaved everyone who injects this new line of plasmids. Suffice it to say that Objectivism is not down with slavery at all. To rob someone of their ability to choose and to produce for their own sake is to rob them of themselves, of their humanity. The fact that Ryan acknowledges this, that Rapture was built on the principles of free will and individualism, yet proceeds anyway, is the very moment that he forgoes Objectivism, and all that follows is a mere consequence.
But the city, it's collapsing before my... Have I become so convinced by my own beliefs that I have stopped seeing the truth? Perhaps. But Atlas is out there, and he aims to destroy me and to destroy my city. To question is to surrender. I will not question.
Ryan knows. He is not so ignorant as to deny his actions. However, in too deep with a gambler's sunk cost fallacy, he knows only how to press on in spite of his doubts. Objectivism is built on questioning. Others, oneself, reality, everything, and there is no greater divergence from Objectivism than the unwillingness to discover the truth. Atlas Shrugged, Part 1, Non-Contradiction, Chapter 7, The Exploiters and the Exploited. Contradictions do not exist. Whenever you think that you are facing a contradiction, check your premises. You will find that one of them is wrong. This statement gives Part 1, Non-Contradiction, its name, and it's another way of stating A is A, but it also gives a method for unraveling the apparent mysteries of reality. Specifically, to understand reality, Objectivism argues it is necessary always to question one's assumptions. Andrew Ryan has now given up questioning, and so he has given up his ability to comprehend reality, guided instead by jealousy and fear.
Ryan nationalised Fontaine Futuristics. He owns it now, lock, stock and barrel. For the good of the city, he says. He'll break it up in due time, he says. I've resigned from the council and lodged me letter of protest, but that's just pissing in the wind. It'll be war, I say, unless somebody stops Ryan, and right fast. I never killed a man, let alone a mate. But this is what things come to. I don't know if killing Mr. Ryan will stop the war, but I know it won't stop while that man breathes. I love Mr. Ryan, but I love Rapture. If I have to kill one to save the other, so be it.
McDonough's story contains raptures, ideals corrupted by human nature. Ryan saw himself as inseparable from his creation, and the thought that he may have drifted from his original vision, though it did cross his mind, was irreconcilable with his emotions, and he chose to stick with the latter. By the time you reach him in Hephaestus, however, it seems he has come to terms with the consequences of his choice. The parasites have come for his creation once again, and he knows that this time he's done for. But that doesn't mean that he will roll over and submit. Quite the contrary, in fact. You see, Ryan is not content to have Rapture exist without him, as without him it never would have existed in the first place. Back in Arcadia, Ryan told the player an anecdote.
On the surface, I once bought a forest. The parasites claimed that the land belonged to God and demanded that I establish a public park. When Congress moved to nationalize my forest, I burnt it to the ground. God did not plant the seeds of this Arcadia. I did.
This moment is lifted directly from the end of Atlas Shrugged Part 1, Non-Contradiction, Chapter 10, Wyatt's Torch. In between the mountains, lighting the sky, throwing a glow that swayed on the roofs and walls of the station, the hill of Wyatt oil was a solid sheet of flame. I am leaving it as I found it. Take over. It's yours. Rand portrays this type of action as a victory of the strikers over the looters, but most critics of Objectivism point to this attitude as the reason many of its followers are unable to handle the, quote, real world, end quote. To the critics, it's a higher stakes version of a child leaving and taking their toys home when another asks to play with them. What purpose can destroying one's own creation serve other than spite? Objectivism argues that morality and reality are intertwined and inseparable, but critics see a seemingly spiteful moral act like this as incompatible with practical reality. So, when Ryan knows that he is going to die, he sees no option other than to take Rapture down with him.
In the end, all that matters to me is me. And all that matters to you is you. It is the nature of things. Does your master hear me? Atlas? You can kill me, but you will never have my city. A season for all things. A time to live and a time to die. A time to build and a time to destroy!
For all his moral failures, Ryan gets a fairly objectivist death, at least as far as he's concerned. In his eyes, he achieves the moral victory by demonstrating that you are subhuman, a mere lab experiment programmed to follow orders, and his ordering you to beat him brutally with a golf club shows just how incapable you are of doing anything significant yourself other than destroy what others have built. Even if he counted on you overriding the self-destruct sequence, and even if he was suspicious about Atlas's identity, Ryan was content to go out in a blaze of glory, in the ultimate triumph over the thoughtless, incapable parasites, and in one of the greatest, most meta video game twists of all time.
These sad saps. They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets. What an angle they gave me. I hand these mugs a cot and a bowl of soup, and they give me their lives. Who needs an army when I got Fontaine's Home for the Poor?
The true evil force in the world of BioShock is not objectivism, nor is it altruism. It's the duplicity of human nature. Fontaine takes advantage of everyone for his own aims, and his pretense charities reveal that he is a villain to both ideologies. He brings up an interesting point, though. Who scrubs the toilets of Atlantis? Objectivism might say a few things. One member of the society would be the most capable plumber and toilet scrubber in the world, who takes pride in their work and does not find it repulsive as others might. 2, this practical problem would lead engineers to develop automatic scrubbers or stainless toilets or something. Or 3, which seems to be how it goes in Atlas Shrugged, all of the strikers in Galt's Gulch double up on roles. John Galt himself is at once an electrical engineer and a general handyman. If toilets need scrubbing, then someone would fill that demand. Now, BioShock puts forth many possible destroyers of an objectivist society. Dangerous technologies, unregulated addictive substances, the corruption of power. But just like scrubbing toilets, objectivism has an answer for all of those things. The actual end of a society like Rapture is the presence of people like Fontaine, and BioShock argues that people like Fontaine will exist everywhere, simply because they are products of societal pressures. It's not a matter of simply not inviting them in, because they come whether you allow them to or not. A society that excludes swaths of the population only creates niches that some members of those swaths once filled, who may now be replaced by any well or ill-meaning individual. Humans want. Some will make, some will give, and some will take.